After I retired, I bought a lakeside ranch to rest. The same week, my son-in-law knocked on my door with a notary. "This ranch is mine now. You have 15 minutes to leave." I didn't react. As I was leaving, I sent a message. "Check the cellar." What he saw made him scream for help. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I never thought my golden years would start with betrayal, but there I was at 65, standing in the kitchen of my dream ranch, watching my own daughter avoid my eyes while her husband waved legal documents in my face like weapons. The ranch had been everything I'd worked for during 43 years as a private investigator. Every sleepless night tracking cheating spouses, every dangerous stakeout watching criminals, every penny saved from cases that sometimes left me questioning humanity. It all led to this moment. 8 acres of pristine lakefront property in Montana, a modest log cabin with a wraparound porch, and finally, the peace I'd earned. I'd closed on the property just 6 days earlier. The seller, an elderly widow named Martha, had tears in her eyes as she handed me the keys. "Take good care of this place, George," she'd said. "My late husband built every board of that cabin with his own hands. I promised her I would, and I meant it." The first 3 days were everything I'd imagined. I woke up to the sound of lapping water instead of sirens. I drank my coffee watching deer graze by the shore instead of staring at case files. I even started a small garden behind the cabin, something I'd never had time for during my working years. Caroline had called on the 4th day, her voice strained in a way that should have warned me. "Dad, Kevin and I need to talk to you about something important. We're driving up tomorrow." I should have asked more questions. I should have pressed her when she deflected my attempts to understand what was so urgent. But I was happy, genuinely happy for the first time in years, and I wanted to share that with my only child. Kevin arrived first, stepping out of his silver BMW like he owned the place. At 38, my son-in-law had always carried himself with an arrogance that rubbed me wrong. But Caroline loved him, so I bit my tongue. Today, though, something was different. His usual fake smile was replaced by cold calculation. "George," he said, not bothering with pleasantries, "we need to discuss your situation here." My situation? I was about to ask what he meant when Caroline's car pulled up behind his. She emerged slowly, her face pale, unable to meet my gaze. That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. "Caroline, honey, what's going on?" I asked as she approached. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Kevin stepped forward, pulling a manila envelope from his jacket. "What's going on, George, is that you've been living in a fantasy." His voice was sharp, cutting. "This property doesn't belong to you." I felt my stomach drop. "What are you talking about? I have the deed, the title, insurance, everything's legal." Kevin's laugh was bitter. "Check your paperwork again, old man. This ranch belongs to Carolyn. She inherited it from her great-aunt Millicent 3 months ago." "That's impossible," I said, my voice steady despite the churning in my gut. "Martha Sullivan owned this place for 40 years. I bought it from her estate." "Martha Sullivan was Caroline's great-aunt," Kevin continued, his eyes gleaming with something that made my skin crawl. "She left everything to her only living relative, your daughter." I looked at Caroline, searching her face for some sign that this was a mistake, some indication that she would defend me. Instead, she stared at the ground, her hands trembling. "Caroline, tell me this isn't true," I whispered. She finally looked up and I saw tears in her eyes. But she didn't speak, she didn't deny it. Kevin pulled documents from the envelope, spreading them on the hood of his car. "Here's the inheritance paperwork, here's the will. And here," he said, pointing to an official-looking document, "is the notice that your purchase was invalid due to prior claims." My hands shook as I examined the papers. They looked legitimate, complete with legal seals and notary stamps, but something felt wrong. In 43 years of investigation, I'd developed instincts about deception, and every fiber of my being was screaming that this was a setup. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "If Caroline inherited the property, why didn't this come up during the title search? Why did Martha's attorney have the legal right to sell?" Kevin's jaw tightened slightly. "Legal complications. The inheritance was tied up in probate, but it's resolved now, and Caroline wants her property back." I turned to my daughter, the The child I'd raised alone after her mother died, the girl I'd worked double shifts to put through college. Caroline, is this what you want? You want me out of my home? For a moment, her resolve seemed to crack. Dad, She started, then stopped, glancing at Kevin. It's not personal. It's legally ours. Legally ours, I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words. And where exactly am I supposed to go? Kevin shrugged with practiced indifference. That's not our problem. You're a smart guy, you'll figure it out. I stood there, processing the magnitude of what was happening. My own daughter, the person I'd sacrificed everything for, was throwing me out of my home based on paperwork that appeared from nowhere. The ranch I'd bought with my life savings, the retirement I'd planned for decades, the peace I'd finally found. All of it was being ripped away by the two people I'd trusted most. But as I looked at Kevin's smug expression and Caroline's guilty face, something clicked in my investigator's mind. The timing was too convenient, the documents too perfect, the story too clean. They thought they were dealing with a broken-down old man who would crumble under pressure. They had no idea what they'd just started. When do you want me out? I asked quietly. Kevin checked his expensive watch. You have 15 minutes to gather your essentials. We'll give you time to arrange for the rest later. 15 minutes to pack up a lifetime and walk away from everything I'd worked for. I nodded slowly, then headed toward the cabin. As I walked up the porch steps, I could hear them talking in low voices behind me, probably congratulating themselves on how easily the old fool had folded. Little did they know I was about to give them a lesson in why you should never underestimate a man who spent his life uncovering the truth. The 15 minutes felt like 15 hours as I moved through my cabin, selecting only what I could carry. Every item I touched held memories of the life I thought I was building. The coffee mug Martha had left behind with a note saying, "For peaceful mornings." The fishing rod I'd bought but never used. The framed photo of Caroline from her college graduation, when she'd hugged me tight and said I was the best father in the world. That seemed like a lifetime ago. I could hear Kevin and Carolyn outside, their voices carrying through the thin cabin walls. Kevin was giving instructions about something, his tone commanding and impatient. Caroline's responses were barely audible, but I caught fragments. I know. I understand. It has to be this way. My hands moved mechanically, folding clothes into my old duffel bag. The same bag I'd used for overnight surveillances, with the cases that took me away from home for days at a time. Back then, Caroline would always hug me goodbye and make me promise to be careful. Now she couldn't even look at me. I grabbed my medication from the bathroom cabinet, my reading glasses from the nightstand, and a few important documents from my desk drawer. The deed to the ranch sat there, mocking me with its official seals and legal language. I'd been so proud when I signed it, finally achieving the dream I'd worked toward for decades. A sharp knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Time's up, George," Kevin called out. "You need to move along." I walked to the door, bag in hand, and stepped onto the porch. Kevin stood at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, looking like a bouncer waiting to escort a troublemaker from a bar. Caroline sat in her car, staring at her phone, still avoiding eye contact. "Keys," Kevin said, holding out his hand. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the set Martha had given me. The keychain was a small wooden fish, hand-carved by her late husband. As I placed it in Kevin's palm, I noticed his hands were sweating despite the cool mountain air. "The utilities are in my name," I said calmly. "You'll need to transfer them." "Already handled," Kevin replied, but there was something in his voice, a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. "What about the basement?" I asked casually. "There are some maintenance issues down there you should know about." Kevin's expression changed instantly. For just a moment I saw something flash across his face. Not confusion, but recognition. Fear, maybe. "What kind of maintenance issues?" "Nothing major," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "Just some old foundation work that needs attention. You'll want to check it out once you're settled." He nodded curtly, but I could see his jaw clench. "We'll handle it." I walked toward my old pickup truck, the same Ford I'd driven for 12 years. It wasn't much, but it was paid for and reliable. As I loaded my bag into the bed, I could feel Kevin watching my every move. "Dad?" Caroline's voice was small, uncertain. She'd finally gotten out of her car. I turned to face her, and for a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to run to me when she scraped her knee or had a nightmare, the little girl who believed her father could fix anything. "What is it, sweetheart?" Her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry it has to be this way. Sorry it has to be this way. Not sorry for what she was doing, but sorry it had to happen. As if she had no choice in the matter, as if this betrayal was inevitable. "I know you are," I said quietly, and I meant it. Looking at her face, I could see the conflict, the guilt, the manipulation that had brought her to this point. Caroline wasn't evil. She was trapped. Kevin stepped closer to her, his hand possessive on her shoulder. "Caroline, we should get inside and start going through the property." I climbed into my truck and rolled down the window. As I started the engine, I pulled out my phone and typed a quick message. Kevin was already heading toward the cabin, but I made sure my voice carried when I spoke. "Caroline," I called out, "you might want to tell Kevin to check the basement before he gets too comfortable. There's something down there he needs to see." I hit send on my message as I said it. The text was simple. "Check the basement. You'll understand everything then." Kevin stopped dead in his tracks. "What did you just send? Who did you text?" I looked at him through my open window, keeping my expression neutral. "Just letting my attorney know about the situation. Standard procedure." It wasn't entirely a lie. I had sent a message, but not to any attorney. I'd sent it to a number I'd programmed into Kevin's phone weeks ago during one of their previous visits. A number that would deliver the message with a slight delay, after I was already gone. Kevin's face had gone pale. "Your attorney?" "Don't worry about it," I said, putting the truck in drive. "Just remember what I said about the basement. Some secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them." As I drove away, I watched in my rearview mirror as Kevin practically ran toward the cabin. Carolyn followed more slowly, confusion written across her face. She probably thought her father was just being dramatic, making some final attempt to maintain dignity in defeat. She had no idea that everything was about to change. The road wound down through the pine trees, taking me away from my dream and toward an uncertain future. But for the first time since Kevin had arrived with his papers, I felt something other than despair. I felt the familiar surge of anticipation that came with closing in on a target. Kevin thought he'd won. He thought he'd successfully manipulated my daughter and stolen my property. He thought he was dealing with a defeated old man who would disappear quietly into the night. He was about to learn that some old men have very long memories and very sharp teeth. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. I glanced at the screen and smiled for the first time in hours. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. I answered the call as I reached the main highway. "It's done," I said simply. "Phase 1 is complete." "And Kevin took the bait?" the voice on the other end asked. "Hook, line, and sinker. He's probably in the basement right now." "Good. How long do you think it'll take him to realize what he's walked into?" I checked my watch. The delayed message should have reached his phone by now. "Any minute now. He always was too clever for his own good." As I drove toward town, I thought about the look on Kevin's face when I'd mentioned the basement. He'd recognized something in my words, something that had triggered a deep, primal fear. That fear was about to become very, very justified. Kevin's hands trembled as he reached for the basement light switch. The wooden steps creaked under his weight as he descended into the musty darkness below the cabin. Caroline's voice echoed from upstairs, calling his name, but he barely heard her over the pounding of his heart. The basement was larger than he'd expected, stretching beneath most of the cabin's footprint. Old stone walls held back the Montana earth, and exposed wooden beams supported the floor above. But it wasn't the construction that made Kevin's blood run cold. It was what George had left behind. Along the far wall, a series of filing cabinets stood like silent sentinels. Each drawer was labeled with dates going back months, some going back years. But it was the corkboard mounted above them that made Kevin's knees buckle. Photographs, dozens of them. Pictures of Kevin entering and leaving various buildings, meeting with different people, conducting business that was supposed to be private. There were telephoto shots of him at restaurants, in parking lots, even inside what he'd thought were secure locations. "What the hell?" Kevin whispered, stepping closer to examine the display. His phone buzzed with the delayed message George had sent. "Check the basement. You'll understand everything then." Kevin's throat went dry. The old man had been watching him. For how long and why? He pulled open the first filing cabinet drawer, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the handles. Inside were manila folders, each labeled with a name he recognized. His business associates, his clients, people he'd been working with on deals that George should have known nothing about. The first folder contained photocopies of bank statements. His bank statements. Transactions he'd made, accounts he'd opened, money he'd moved, financial records that should have been completely private. "Kevin," Caroline's voice drifted down from upstairs. "What's taking so long?" He couldn't answer. His mouth had gone completely dry as he opened folder after folder, each one revealing another layer of surveillance. Phone records showing calls he'd made, credit card statements tracking his purchases, even hotel receipts from business trips Caroline knew nothing about. But it was the folder labeled Property Acquisition Scheme that made him sink into the old wooden chair positioned in front of the filing system. Inside were copies of forged documents, the very documents he'd used to convince Caroline that she'd inherited the ranch. But these weren't his originals. These were photocopies, and written across each one in George's careful handwriting were notes: forged notary seal, false inheritance claim, fabricated death certificate. George knew. He'd known all along that the inheritance story was a lie. Kevin's vision blurred as he flipped through page after page of evidence. There were copies of his communications with the document forger, bank records showing payments for the fake paperwork, even photographs of him meeting with the man who'd created the false inheritance documents. How was this possible? Kevin had been so careful, so methodical. He'd researched George for months before approaching Caroline with his plan. The old man was supposed to be a retired private investigator, winding down his career with small-time cases. He wasn't supposed to be capable of this level of sophisticated surveillance. A manila envelope marked audio recordings sat at the bottom of the drawer. Kevin's hands shook as he opened it, revealing a collection of small cassette tapes, each labeled with dates and locations. The first tape was labeled Caroline's Kitchen, March 15th. Kevin remembered that date. It was when he'd first suggested to Caroline that she should look into her family's property holdings, planting the seeds for the inheritance story he'd later fabricate. With growing dread, Kevin noticed an old cassette player sitting on a nearby shelf. He inserted the tape and pressed play, praying he wouldn't hear what he suspected was on it. His own voice filled the basement, crystal clear. "Your father's got more money than he knows what to do with, Caroline. And that ranch he's always talking about buying? What if I told you there was a way you could inherit property instead of watching him spend your future inheritance on his retirement fantasies?" Caroline's voice responded uncertain. "I don't understand what you mean. I'm just saying family property has a way of passing down through generations. Sometimes people don't even know what they're entitled to." The conversation continued, documenting Kevin's careful manipulation of his wife, his gradual introduction of the inheritance concept, and Caroline's slow acceptance of his version of events. Every word was preserved, every lie documented. Kevin ejected the tape with shaking fingers and grabbed another one, labeled Attorney's Office, April 2nd. This recording captured his meeting with the document forger, the man he'd paid $8,000 to create the fake inheritance paperwork. "You understand this is completely illegal," the forger's voice warned on the tape. "I understand that $5,000 covers a lot of understanding," Kevin's recorded voice replied coldly. "It's $8,000 for this level of work. These documents need to fool lawyers and title companies. Fine, $8,000. Just make sure they're perfect." Kevin's hands were shaking so violently now that he could barely operate the cassette player. How had George managed to record a private meeting in a closed office? How long had the old man been tracking his activities? He opened another file drawer and found his answer. Photographs showed George in various surveillance positions, sitting in cars across from buildings Kevin had visited, positioned at coffee shops where Kevin had conducted meetings, even disguised as maintenance workers in locations where Kevin thought he was completely safe. The old man hadn't just stumbled onto Kevin's scheme. He'd been conducting a full-scale investigation for months, maybe longer. Every move Kevin had made, Every lie he'd told, every document he'd forged, all of it had been carefully documented by someone who clearly still possessed all the skills that had made him successful as a private investigator. But the most chilling discovery was in the final file drawer. A folder labeled Future Plans contained detailed notes about Kevin's intentions beyond stealing the ranch. There were copies of emails Kevin had sent to real estate developers discussing the property's potential for subdivision and development. Notes about his plans to manipulate Caroline into signing over power of attorney. Even research into George's other assets and how they might be acquired. George had known not just about the current scheme, but about Kevin's long-term plans to systematically strip both him and Caroline of everything they owned. Kevin. Caroline's voice was closer now, at the top of the basement stairs. "What are you doing down there?" Kevin looked around the basement in panic. This wasn't just evidence of his crimes. This was a complete dossier that could destroy his life. If George had copies of all this material, if he'd shared it with authorities. His phone rang and George's name appeared on the screen. Kevin stared at it for 3 rings before finally answering. "You bastard," Kevin whispered into the phone. George's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I see you found my little archive. How long have you been watching me? Long enough to know exactly what kind of man my daughter married. Long enough to document every crime you've committed in the past year." Kevin's mind raced. "What do you want?" "Want?" George chuckled. "Kevin, I don't want anything from you. This isn't a negotiation." "Then why? Why show me all this?" "Because I wanted you to know that I know. I wanted you to understand that you didn't outsmart anybody. You walked into a trap that's been waiting for you for months." Caroline's footsteps were on the basement stairs now. "Kevin, who are you talking to?" Kevin looked up to see his wife descending into the basement, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she took in the surveillance materials surrounding him. "Dad?" she said into the silence. "Is that Dad on the phone?" Kevin ended the call and stood slowly, knowing that everything was about to change. The evidence surrounding them told a story that Caroline would have to face, and there was no way to hide it now. The trap George had set wasn't just about exposing Kevin's crimes. It was about opening Caroline's eyes to the truth about the man she'd married and the choice she'd made when she'd chosen him over her father. As Caroline moved closer to examine the files scattered around Kevin, he realized that George's revenge was going to be far more devastating than he'd ever imagined. 3 months earlier, I'd been sitting in my small apartment above the hardware store in Billings, going through my final case files before retirement. 43 years of private investigation had taught me to notice patterns, to spot deception, and to trust my instincts when something felt wrong. That morning, my instincts were screaming. Caroline had called the night before with news that should have made me happy. Kevin had been promoted at his investment firm, she'd said. They were doing well financially, but there was something in her voice, a hesitation, a careful choice of words, that triggered every alarm bell I'd developed over 4 decades of dealing with liars. I'd always been suspicious of Kevin. When Caroline first brought him home 5 years ago, I'd run a background check. It's not something most fathers do, but most fathers aren't private investigators. What I'd found was clean, almost too clean. A credit history that started exactly when he claimed, employment records that checked out, references that all said the right things. But in my experience, people who looked perfect on paper usually weren't. The morning after Caroline's call, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of closing my last case file and enjoying retirement, I opened a new one. Kevin Matthews, my son-in-law. I started with the basics: financial records, employment verification, social connections. Kevin worked for Pinnacle Investment Group, a mid-sized firm that managed portfolios for wealthy clients. His salary was decent but not exceptional, certainly not enough to support the lifestyle he and Caroline seemed to be living. That's when I discovered the first red flag. Kevin had opened 7 different bank accounts in the past 2 years, each in a different state. For most people, that might indicate frequent moves or business requirements. For someone in my profession, it suggested money laundering or fraud preparation. I spent the next 2 weeks conducting surveillance, following Kevin's daily routines, documenting his activities. What I found disturbed me more than I'd expected. Kevin wasn't just working at Pinnacle Investment Group, he was systematically defrauding their elderly clients. I watched him meet with octogenarians in coffee shops, convincing them to move their assets into safer investments that he personally managed. What these clients didn't know was that Kevin was funneling their money into accounts he controlled, leaving them with worthless paper while he built his personal fortune. But the elderly clients weren't his only targets. I discovered that Kevin had been researching my financial situation for months. He'd somehow accessed my banking records, my property holdings, even my retirement account information. He knew exactly how much money I had, where it was invested, and when I planned to access it. The pieces of his plan became clear when I followed him to a meeting with a document forger named Raymond Cruz. I'd encountered Cruz during a previous investigation. He specialized in creating fake inheritance documents and fraudulent property claims. I watched from across the street as Kevin handed Cruz a manila envelope and received a thicker envelope in return. That night, I broke into Kevin's car and found photocopies of the documents Cruz had created. Fake death certificates for relatives Caroline never knew she had. Forged inheritance paperwork claiming she was entitled to various properties throughout Montana. And most shocking of all, a fabricated will supposedly leaving her my dream ranch, a property that Kevin somehow knew I was planning to purchase. I realized then that Kevin's plan was more sophisticated than simple theft. He was going to use Caroline's love for him and her guilt about our sometimes strained relationship to manipulate her into believing she deserved compensation for her difficult childhood. He would present the inheritance as a way for her to finally have the security her father had never provided. The brilliance of his scheme was that it made Caroline the beneficiary rather than Kevin himself. If anyone investigated, it would appear that a daughter was simply claiming her rightful inheritance. Kevin would remain in the background, the supportive husband helping his wife navigate complex legal matters. But Kevin had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the man he was trying to deceive. I spent the next month setting up my counter operation. I purchased surveillance equipment more sophisticated than anything I'd used during my official career. I rented observation posts near Kevin's frequent meeting locations. I even cultivated relationships with some of his criminal associates, presenting myself as a potential client for document forgery services. The basement setup at the ranch wasn't something I created after buying the property. It was something I'd planned from the beginning. I knew Kevin would eventually make his move, and I wanted to be ready with a revelation that would destroy him completely. Installing the surveillance equipment in the basement was the easy part. The harder task was obtaining the evidence without alerting Kevin to my investigation. This required calling in favors from former law enforcement contacts, using techniques I'd developed over decades of investigation, and taking risks that would have ended my career if I'd still been working officially. The audio recordings were the most challenging to obtain. Recording Kevin's meeting with the document forger required me to pose as a maintenance worker and install listening devices in the building's conference room. Capturing his conversations with Carolyn meant hiding recording equipment in their home during one of my visits, then retrieving it weeks later. Every piece of evidence in that basement represented hours of careful planning and dangerous surveillance work. Kevin thought he was manipulating a retired old man who'd lost his edge. Instead, he was walking into a trap set by someone who'd spent his entire career catching people exactly like him. The hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence. It was watching Caroline get drawn deeper into Kevin's web of lies. I saw her struggling with guilt over our relationship, believing Kevin's subtle suggestions that she deserved more than I'd given her. I watched her wrestle with the inheritance story, wanting to believe it was true, but sensing something wasn't right. There were moments when I wanted to intervene, to warn her about what Kevin was doing. But I knew that without irrefutable proof, she would choose to believe her husband over her father. The only way to save her was to let Kevin's plan proceed until he'd committed crimes that couldn't be explained away or forgiven. The day Kevin appeared at the ranch with his forged documents, I was ready. Every conversation was being recorded. Every document was being photographed. Every action was being documented by surveillance cameras Kevin never knew existed. When I sent that text message about checking the basement, I wasn't just taunting Kevin. I was activating the final phase of an operation I'd been planning for months. Kevin was about to discover that he hadn't just stolen property from a retired private investigator. He'd walked into a carefully constructed trap that would expose every crime he'd committed and every lie he'd told. The evidence in that basement wasn't just about the ranch. It was documentation of Kevin's systematic fraud against elderly clients, his forgery of legal documents, his manipulation of Caroline, and his plans to expand his criminal activities into a full-scale operation targeting vulnerable senior citizens. Kevin thought he'd won when he forced me out of my home. He had no idea that losing the ranch was exactly what I'd planned for, and that everything he was about to discover in that basement had been waiting for him like a spider waiting for a fly. The phone call I'd received as I drove away wasn't from my attorney. It was from Detective Sarah Chen, my former partner from the police department, confirming that all the evidence had been properly documented and that the arrest warrants were ready to be executed. Kevin's criminal empire was about to come crashing down, and Caroline was about to learn the truth about the man she'd married. The only question now was whether she would choose to be a victim of Kevin's deception or an accomplice to his crimes. Caroline stared at the photographs covering the basement wall, her face pale in the dim light. Her fingers traced over images of Kevin entering buildings she didn't recognize, meeting with people she'd never seen before, conducting business that looked nothing like the investment work he'd described to her. "Kevin," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is all this?" Kevin stood frozen beside the filing cabinets, his hands still gripping the folder containing evidence of his document forgery scheme. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool basement air. He looked like a cornered animal, desperately searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "Caroline, I can explain," he started, but his voice cracked on the words. She turned to face him, and Kevin saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but a cold, analytical assessment. For the first time since he'd known her, Caroline was looking at him the way her father would have looked at a suspect. "Explain what?" she asked quietly. "Explain why my father has surveillance photos of you? Explain why there are recordings of conversations I never knew you had, or explain why you told me I inherited this ranch when these documents show you paid someone to forge inheritance papers." Kevin's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Every explanation he tried to formulate in his mind sounded pathetic, unbelievable, or incriminating. Caroline picked up one of the audio cassette tapes, reading the label aloud. "Caroline's Kitchen, March 15th. She looked at Kevin with dawning horror. "He recorded us in our own home? Your father is crazy," Kevin finally managed to say. "This is stalking, harassment. None of this would be admissible in court." But even as he said it, Kevin knew it wasn't true. George hadn't just been collecting evidence randomly. Everything in this basement was methodically organized, properly documented, and legally obtained. This wasn't the work of an obsessed father. It was the product of a professional investigation conducted by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Caroline was examining the files now, pulling out bank statements that showed Kevin's hidden accounts, credit card records documenting purchases she'd never known about, phone bills listing calls to numbers she didn't recognize. $8,000 to Raymond Cruz, she read from one of the documents. Payment for document services. She looked up at Kevin. What kind of document services cost $8,000? Kevin's phone began ringing. George's name appeared on the screen again. This time, Caroline saw it. "Answer it," she said firmly. Kevin shook his head. "Caroline, we don't have to." "Answer the phone, Kevin." With trembling fingers, Kevin accepted the call and put it on speaker. George's voice filled the basement, calm and measured. "Hello, Caroline." "Dad?" Caroline's voice was small, uncertain. "What is all this?" "It's the truth, sweetheart. Everything your husband has been hiding from you for the past year." Kevin found his voice. "George, you're sick. This obsession with me, this stalking." Stalking? George's chuckle was cold. Kevin, I've been investigating you. There's a difference. Stalking is what you did to those elderly clients before you defrauded them of their life savings. Caroline's face went white. Elderly clients? Ask him about Mrs. Patterson, George continued. 83 years old, widowed, living on Social Security. Kevin convinced her to invest her late husband's life insurance payout in a fund that doesn't exist. She lost $67,000. Kevin's hands were shaking violently now. That's not... I never... Or Mr. Chen, George continued relentlessly. 91 years old, early-stage dementia. Kevin took advantage of his condition to transfer $93,000 from his retirement account into one of Kevin's private accounts. The family is still trying to recover the money. Caroline sank into the old wooden chair, staring at Kevin with growing horror. Please tell me this isn't true. Kevin opened his mouth to deny it, but George wasn't finished. There are 17 victims so far, Caroline. 17 elderly people who trusted your husband with their life savings. The total amount stolen is over $800,000. The number hit Caroline like a physical blow. $800,000. She thought about the expensive dinners Kevin had been taking her to, the weekend trips, the jewelry he'd surprised her with. Money she'd assumed came from his success at the investment firm. The ranch inheritance was just Kevin's way of expanding his operation, George continued. He needed a base of operations, somewhere he could bring potential victims for meetings that looked legitimate, a place where he could present himself as a successful property owner rather than a fraud artist working out of rented office space. Caroline looked around the basement, seeing it with new eyes. You knew, she whispered. You knew all along that the inheritance was fake. I've known for months, George confirmed. I've been documenting everything, waiting for Kevin to make his final move. What you see in that basement is just a portion of the evidence I've collected. Kevin suddenly lunged toward the filing cabinets, grabbing armfuls of documents and folders. I'm not letting you destroy my life with this garbage. But Caroline moved faster than he expected, intercepting him before he could reach the stairs. Stop, she said firmly. Just stop. Kevin dropped the files, papers scattering across the basement floor. He looked at Caroline with desperate eyes. You have to believe me. Your father is manipulating you. He's always hated me, always tried to turn you against me. By documenting your crimes? Caroline's voice was steady now, the initial shock giving way to cold anger. By protecting elderly people from being defrauded? By trying to save me from discovering that my husband is a criminal? George's voice came through the phone speaker again. Caroline, there's something else you need to know. Kevin didn't choose you by accident. He researched you for months before you met. He knew you were a private investigator's daughter, knew you had access to your father's money, knew you felt guilty about our relationship. He targeted you specifically because he thought you would be easy to manipulate. Caroline closed her eyes, remembering their first meeting at the coffee shop near her work. Kevin had seemed so charming, so interested in her stories about growing up with a father who was always working dangerous cases. She'd thought it was romantic how he listened to her complaints about feeling neglected, how he understood her frustration with George's distant parenting style. Now she realized it had all been an act. Kevin had been collecting information about her vulnerabilities, learning exactly what to say to make her fall in love with him. The promotion at Pinnacle Investment Group was fake too, George continued. Kevin was fired 6 months ago for suspicious activity involving client accounts. He's been running his fraud operation full-time ever since, using fake business cards and a rented office to maintain the illusion that he still worked there. Caroline opened her eyes and looked at Kevin, who was slumped against the stone wall, all fight gone out of him. Is it true? Kevin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The evidence surrounding them told the story clearly enough. Caroline's phone buzzed with a text message. She looked at the screen and saw a number she didn't recognize. But the message was clear. Police are en route. Warrant for Kevin Matthews' arrest being executed. Detective Chen. Kevin saw the message too. His face went completely white. Caroline, please, we can work this out. We can leave, start over somewhere else. With stolen money? Caroline's voice was ice cold. Using identities you've probably already forged? How many other people would you hurt, Kevin? How many other families would you destroy? The sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside the cabin. Through the small basement window, Carolyn could see flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the trees. Kevin looked toward the basement stairs as if considering making a run for it, but Caroline stepped between him and the exit. "It's over," she said quietly. "Whatever you thought you were going to accomplish here, whatever you thought you were going to take from my father and me, it's over." Footsteps thundered across the cabin floor above them, followed by authoritative voices calling Kevin's name. Caroline heard her father's voice among them, giving directions to the officers about the evidence in the basement. As the police descended the stairs, Carolyn realized that her father hadn't just set a trap for Kevin. He'd orchestrated Kevin's complete downfall while simultaneously proving to Caroline exactly what kind of man she'd married. The humiliation of being forced out of his own home had been George's sacrifice to ensure that Caroline would see the truth with her own eyes, in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. Kevin was about to lose everything: his freedom, his stolen money, his false identity, and most importantly to him, his control over Caroline. But Caroline was about to gain something she'd lost years ago: respect for the father who'd never stopped protecting her, even when she couldn't see the danger she was in. 6 weeks later, I stood on the deck of my ranch, watching the morning mist rise from the lake. The coffee in my mug was still hot, steam curling up into the crisp Montana air. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. Kevin had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for elder fraud, forgery, and identity theft. The judge had been particularly harsh, noting that Kevin had specifically targeted vulnerable, elderly victims and shown no remorse for his crimes. The $843,000 he'd stolen was being returned to his victims, though the emotional damage he'd caused couldn't be so easily repaired. Caroline sat in the wooden chair beside me, her own coffee growing cold as she stared out at the water. We'd been having these quiet morning conversations for the past month, slowly rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and Kevin's careful manipulation. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Patterson," Caroline said quietly. 83 years old, and she trusted him completely. I nodded, remembering the elderly woman's testimony at Kevin's sentencing hearing. She'd been too frail to attend in person, but her victim impact statement had been read aloud by the prosecutor. $67,000 represented her entire life savings, money she'd planned to leave to her grandchildren. "You'll be okay," I told Caroline. "The restitution program will cover most of what she lost, and her family is taking care of her now." Caroline turned to look at me, her eyes still carrying the weight of guilt she'd been struggling with since Kevin's arrest. I should have known. All those expensive dinners, the trips, the jewelry. I should have questioned where the money was coming from. "Kevin was a professional manipulator," I said gently. "He studied you for months before you even met, learning exactly what to say and do to gain your trust. You weren't naive, sweetheart. You were targeted by someone who made deception his profession." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching a pair of eagles circle over the lake. The morning was peaceful in a way that felt earned rather than given. "I owe you an apology," Caroline said finally, "for not trusting you, for choosing him over you, for letting him convince me that you were the problem in our relationship." I set down my coffee mug and looked at my daughter. At 34, she was still the little girl who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared her, but now she carried herself with a strength I recognized, the same strength that had helped me survive 43 years of dealing with the worst aspects of human nature. "You don't owe me anything," I said. "Kevin spent months convincing you that I was a distant, uncaring father. He used every insecurity you'd ever had about our relationship as a weapon against both of us." Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "But some of those insecurities were real, Dad. You were gone a lot when I was growing up. You missed school events, soccer games, graduation parties. I did feel neglected sometimes." I nodded, accepting the truth in her words. "I was trying to build a future for us. After your mother died, I thought providing for you financially was the most important thing I could do. I worked extra cases to pay for your education, to make sure you'd never want for anything. But I realize now that what you needed most was just for me to be present. I understand that now, Caroline said softly. I understand that you were doing your best with an impossible situation. Kevin used my resentment about your absences to convince me that you'd never really loved me. He made me believe that I deserved compensation for my difficult childhood. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Kevin had used Caroline's feelings of abandonment to isolate her from the one person who would have protected her from his schemes. How did you know? Caroline asked. What made you suspicious of Kevin in the first place? I smiled, remembering those early warning signs that had triggered my investigation. 43 years of reading people. Kevin was too smooth, too perfect. His background was clean in a way that suggested careful construction rather than genuine innocence. And there was something about the way he asked questions about you, about our family, that felt more like interrogation than conversation. You investigated him from the beginning? Basic background check when you first started dating seriously. Nothing invasive, just making sure he wasn't wanted for anything or hiding obvious red flags. But when he started asking detailed questions about my finances and retirement plans, I knew something was wrong. Caroline shook her head in amazement. You've been protecting me my whole life, haven't you? Even when I couldn't see it. That's what fathers do, I said simply. Even when their daughters think they're being overprotective or controlling. A boat moved slowly across the lake, its wake disturbing the perfect reflection of the surrounding mountains. We watched it pass in comfortable silence. Detective Chen called yesterday, Caroline said. The FBI thinks Kevin's operation was even larger than they initially believed. They've found evidence linking him to similar fraud schemes in 3 other states. I wasn't surprised. Men like Kevin didn't start with sophisticated multi-state operations. They built their skills over time, refining their techniques with each victim. Are you going to testify at the other trials? I asked. Caroline nodded. I think I have to. If my testimony helps convict him for other crimes, helps other families get justice, then it's worth reliving all of this. I felt a surge of pride at her words. The Caroline who had stood in my driveway 6 weeks ago, supporting Kevin's theft of my property, had been a victim of manipulation. This Caroline, the one who was willing to face public scrutiny to help other victims, was the daughter I'd always known she could be. Have you decided what you want to do about work? I asked. Caroline had taken a leave of absence from her job as a school administrator while dealing with the aftermath of Kevin's arrest. Actually, I've been thinking about that, she said, turning to face me with more animation than I'd seen from her in weeks. Detective Chen mentioned that the FBI is looking for consultants to help identify elder fraud schemes, people who understand how these predators think, how they choose their victims. You'd be good at that, I said. You've seen Kevin's methods from the inside. You understand how manipulators operate? I was thinking I might go back to school too. Get some training in criminal psychology, maybe victim advocacy. Turn this whole nightmare into something useful. I nodded approvingly. Caroline had always been strongest when she had a purpose, a way to help others. This new direction would give her a chance to transform her experience with Kevin into a tool for protecting other potential victims. The ranch could be your base of operations, I offered. Plenty of room for an office, and the peace and quiet might be good for thinking through complex cases. Caroline smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from her since Kevin's arrest. Are you offering me a job, Dad? I'm offering you a partnership. Hathaway and Hathaway Investigations. You handle the victim advocacy and fraud prevention consulting. I'll take on the occasional case that requires someone with more experience dealing with dangerous situations. You're supposed to be retired, Caroline pointed out. I'm supposed to be at peace, I corrected, and working with my daughter to protect people like Mrs. Patterson. That sounds pretty peaceful to me. Caroline stood up and walked to the deck railing, looking out over the lake that had become the center of our new life together. Kevin thought he was so clever, she said. He thought he'd planned for every contingency. He made the classic mistake, I replied. He underestimated his opponent. Kevin saw a retired private investigator and an emotionally vulnerable woman. He never considered that we might be a father and daughter who would ultimately choose each other over everything else. Carolyn turned back to me, and I saw something in her expression that I hadn't seen in years. Respect, love, and the kind of trust that could only come from surviving a crisis together. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not giving up on me, for not letting Kevin destroy our family completely, for being willing to sacrifice your own happiness to save me from making the biggest mistake of my life." I stood up and wrapped my arms around my daughter, holding her the way I should have held her more often when she was growing up. The morning sun was warming the deck, the lake was peaceful, and for the first time in years, Caroline and I were truly together. Kevin had thought he could steal my ranch, my money, and my daughter. Instead, his greed and manipulation had given me back the most important thing I'd ever lost: my relationship with Caroline. As we stood there watching the eagles circle over the lake, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemy. It's building something better from the ruins they leave behind. The ranch was still mine, my daughter was safe, and Kevin would spend the next 12 years learning that some old men are far more dangerous than they appear. Justice had been served, and our new life together was just beginning.